Now it's time to welcome our first panel. There has been a great deal of activity and discussions lately concerning the threat of drones used for hostile purposes. Captain Herman is a Sun Country Airlines pilot who flies 737s and serves as our Aviation Security Council chair. Eric will moderate the discussion with his panel of experts to explore and explain the current state of this technological threat and countermeasures to it. Thank you, Eric. The floor is all yours.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm pleased to moderate the first panel of today's conference, titled The Rogue Drone, the Threat Perspective. Unmanned aircraft systems or drones, as we know, are remotely piloted aircraft without pilots on board. Over the past few years, ALPA, industry, and government have been working to safely integrate drones into the national airspace system. For the most part, the safety angle has been the prevailing discussion regarding the drone dilemma. There's been much less discussion about the security aspects related to drones, and there hasn't really been much discussion on protecting the airspace and protecting airports from individuals who might intend to do harm using a drone. That was the case really up until last year when drone sightings near London's Gatwick and Newark Liberty International Airports shut down the runways and airspace, causing significant travel delays for passengers and millions of dollars in lost revenues for airlines. So now security is kind of in the spotlight. Keeping aviation's critical infrastructure secure is an immense challenge. It's going to require innovative approaches that will need to interoperate with existing aviation technologies. So today we're going to discuss the threat drones pose to our industry, drone detection and counter mitigation technologies, plus we'll discuss what needs to change legislatively to allow the proper agencies to give them the authority to take down a rogue drone. The panelists with us today are here to discuss the complexity of counter drone or drone security mitigation, and they represent the majority of stakeholders concerned with rogue drones. So I'm pleased to welcome Angela Stubblefield. Angela has served as a Deputy Associate Administrator for Security and Hazardous Materials Safety for the Federal Aviation Administration since 2013. As a leader with more than 25 years of comprehensive expertise, Angela is a highly respected advisor within the FAA and other departments and agencies who work together to resolve high-impact national security, safety, and crisis response challenges. Special Agent Craig Marech was appointed as Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Special Operations Division Airspace Security Branch of the U.S. Secret Service in March of 2016. In his role, Craig is responsible for the design, development, and implementation of all Secret Service airspace security plans for locations visited by the President and the Vice President of the United States. Justin Barkowski is Vice President, Regulatory Affairs for the American Association of Airport Executives. In his role, Justin represents and advocates for AAAE's members before many federal agencies overseeing U.S. airports. He primarily focuses on airport operations and safety issues, unmanned aircraft systems integration, commercial space transportation, and environmental matters. Justin served on the Drone Advisory Subcommittee, the Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team, and co-chaired the 26th Coalition for UAS Safety, which brought aviation associations together to collaborate on safe UAS integration. Charlie Keegan is the owner of Aviation Management Associates. It's an aerospace-focused consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. Charlie spent 27 years with the FAA in various senior leadership programs and positions, and initiated and served as the chairman of the Joint Planning and Development Office. He received numerous awards and commendations, including a gold medal from the Secretary of Transportation and a Superior Achievement Award from the Vice President of the United States. Orion Kingman is a Boeing 757 First Officer for United Airlines. Orion is currently volunteering as the United Airlines MEC Security Vice Chairman, and he also serves as our co-subject matter expert for unmanned aerial systems for the ALPA National Security Council. Orion has earned his Master in Arts in Emergency Management and Homeland Security. His capstone research attempts to quantify the risk exposure to commercial aircraft from small UAS in the current environment. So good morning, everybody. I would like to ask each panelist to provide their unique perspectives on the rogue drone in turn, after which we'll begin the roundtable discussion. So Angela, I know first off this morning you're kind of going to discuss and highlight the 4 axes of USA security activity today.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. So the FAA, as we talk about UAS security, we look across the full spectrum, everything from what you can do at the aircraft level, at the airspace level, and at the operator level. And there's kind of 4 main areas that we're working on as it pertains to UAS security that I think would be informative for this group. First, you have to have a strong regulatory regime. And that's a lot of that comes through rulemaking. And so one of the key rulemaking activities that the FAA is working on right now is remote identification. That will require all UAS basically to have an electronic license plate or an electronic tail number that will enable the FAA and law enforcement some ability for threat discrimination. You will know, connect it to the operator location, the UAS location, and then that registration information. So that will enable us to know something about UAS that are flying. Anonymous flying within the national airspace system is inconsistent with safety or security, as I know you all appreciate. So we're working very hard. That is probably the top priority for UAS rulemaking within the agency and within the department, and we're looking to expedite that as quickly as possible because that's really foundational, not only from the security perspective of knowing who's flying in the airspace and when someone is conducting unauthorized operations, being able to get to that operator and get that aircraft safely out of the airspace, but also from the safety perspective and the integration perspective of being able to enable more complex operations beyond visual line of sight, delivery, all of the things that are exciting about the use of UAS. We also have tethered the operations over people rule to having remote ID. So those more complex operations will not be enabled until we have remote identification requirements in the national airspace system. Secondly, so we kind of think about it from that's the prevention piece, right? People also getting educated through the authority that Congress gave the FAA over recreational users and putting in requirements around knowledge testing, requirements to adhere to airspace restrictions, and other things that prior to October of 2018, the FAA did not have the authority to require of recreational operators. So really establishing that set of rules across all operations, whether they're recreational or for commercial purposes, and that's extremely important. Then we kind of look at the detection piece. So we've been working with airports, and I'm sure Justin will talk about that, with the concern, obviously heightened in December 2018 with what we saw at Gatwick, of being able to identify and deal with the potential risk of an unauthorized UAS operation in the airport environment. A lot of airport operators are now acquiring UAS detection technology, and so we want to work with them on how to integrate that into the airport environment in a safe way. One, to ensure there's no interference. Secondly, to ensure there's no obstruction. But thirdly, when you have a detection, how do you react and respond to it? Sending 4 patrol cars to the end of the runway can actually create a safety hazard that's greater than potentially what the UAS itself being present may have presented. So we want to make sure that's done in a coordinated manner with all the relevant stakeholders at the airport. And additionally, though, we understand that there will be potentially, and we saw it in Gatwick, a persistent UAS disruption at an airport. And so right now, with the legal authorities that exist, that primarily for counter UAS are only vested in 4 federal departments, Defense, Energy, Homeland Security, and Justice, how do we take those authorities and the technology that's currently fielded and put those together to be able to project them into an airport environment when we have a persistent threat? And the interagency within the federal government has been working on a concept of operations that we have been working with our airport stakeholders and air carriers on a collaborative process for how we would do that in as expedient a manner as possible to address a persistent risk. And then we talk about the counter UAS piece and the 4 departments that have it. The FAA is working very closely, as required by statute, with the 4 departments on how they actually implement and deploy counter UAS technology into the airspace system. Because a lot of that technology, which is largely built off of military technology used in places where the collateral impacts aren't all that important to us, can have significant impacts on air navigation services infrastructure, as well as onboard avionics. And some of you who fly overseas, particularly in the Middle East, probably are familiar with some of the impacts that can occur when you use things like jammers. And so we want to be very careful that as we introduce that into the NAS to deal with a security risk associated with small UAS, that we're not creating a safety hazard for manned or compliant unmanned aircraft. So those are kind of the places that we're looking. In our reauthorization work, kind of the fourth piece is the FAA was directed to do a lot of testing of UAS detection and mitigation technology in the airport environment and figure out how to come up with standards so that this can be safely employed throughout the NAS, not only around airports, but other types of installations as well. And so we're looking at how we can do that testing and come up with standards that will allow manufacturers to build counter-UAS systems that have less impact on the NAS and are effective in countering the threat.
Thanks, Angela. Craig? You know, we've seen overseas weaponization of drones by ISIS. We've seen a political assassination attempt overseas. How big of an issue is this for the Secret Service?
Well, good morning. So for the Secret Service, this is, we used to say it was an emerging threat. It's no longer an emerging threat. It's a threat that's here right now. It's been around for a while. Every incident that does occur in and around the world, we're tracking. We're trying to identify. We're looking for the vulnerabilities, and then we're looking for the countermeasures. We work very hard with our partners to identify solutions to the problems. It's a tough solution to come out. But our primary mission, and especially the Airspace Security Branch, is to identify a plan to secure the airspace in and around where our protectees travel. So that would be when the President travels and the Vice President travels. Of course, we also have the National Capital Region here to ensure that we are taking care of our protected sites, but also some of the responsibilities we have in the prohibited area. So with the advent of the drones, and then as you get a great tool out there, you always know that the bad guy is looking at using that against us. And one of my first involvements was back in 2015. I don't know if everybody here remembers. It was a gentleman who appeared to may have had a few too many drinks, was flying his drone, and ended up landing a quadcopter on the White House grounds. So it gleaned a lot of attention. I also learned that probably is not the best day to wear a suit to the office, because then you have to go review 2,000 hours of video to figure out what happened. So we moved on from there to some incidents that we've actually been tracking. And then, I don't know if anybody here remembers, in 2017, a Black Hawk helicopter was struck by a quadcopter while conducting operations during the United Nations General Assembly. So that brings a lot of attention to our mission, because we utilize aircraft, we use helicopters, we use fighter jets. We have a few other national security type things, such as Air Force One, Marine One, Air Force Two, Marine Two. So it really concerned us. We've actually been tracking some of the issues that are in close proximity to the aviation side of the house. So these are just some of the things that we are concerned about. We work it every day. We're working with our partners. The Reauthorization Act is actually helping us out because we're able to engage a little bit more. And as we move forward, we are involved in pretty much every technology that's out there to try to identify the best solution to the problem, which is the rogue drone or the UAS that could potentially pose a threat to us.
Justin, are the airport's ground zero for the drone threat?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thanks for having us. I know ALPA does a great job with this forum every year, so very happy to be included in the program. So airports, since the Gatwick incident in December, this has probably been our biggest issue that we've been trying to wrap our heads around. We have a ton of engagement from our airports, so that should be good news for everyone in this room, that the airport community, particularly since that incident, has been highly engaged on this topic, trying to do everything that we can to make sure that the skies around the airport are safe, so working with all of the partners that we usually do. So that's the good news, that we are engaging a significant amount with everyone. Obviously, the big problems from our view are the safety concerns. We're trying to help all of you out in this room, as well as many of the airlines and the traveling public, make sure everyone stays safe. But there's also some other considerations and problems that maybe not everyone always thinks about, the economic losses that come from this. I know we don't always like to think about money, but it is a factor. In the Gatwick incident, for instance, you had 20 to 50 million pounds, lost because of the 36-hour shutdown that happened in December. Just to give you, an idea of what it would be like here, I know there's pretty big airports, the hubs in this country. It's around $4 to $5 million an hour if they were to have to shut down. So if you do the math, if we had a 36-hour shutdown in this country, in a big airport, it would be a significant loss. And also the humanitarian problems that we have. So in the Gatwick case, 36-hour shutdown resulted in 160,000 people missing flights. You can imagine all the number of people that would be hanging out in terminals waiting for various food and supplies and just being able to sleep. I mean, it is really a humanitarian. I mean, some of these places can turn into like a refugee camp in many ways. So there's a number of different challenges that airports have to deal with when there is a shutdown or some sort of disruption. And the challenges and the solutions are not easy. I know I've seen a number of different articles that say, why can't we just solve this problem very quickly? There's a number of issues. For airports, our biggest concern is, there is technology that's out there, but as Angela, was kind of alluding to, there are a number of different companies in the market. I think I've seen over 200 products at least that we're aware of, and there's a lot of manufacturers out there, and airports are having a difficult time vetting all of those companies and trying to determine who has the best product, what works, what doesn't work. So it's very difficult to navigate a very crowded marketplace. There's questions about whether or not they should be even operating, the airports should be even operating them. I know we've talked a lot about UAS, and Angela's heard me go on the spiel quite a bit, but small UAS have been defined as aircraft, and aircraft separation services are performed by FAA. And so there's some question in airports' minds on, is this even their responsibility to monitor the airspace near an airport? Obviously, we're taking it on because we don't, we want to make sure that things stay safe. So, we're taking on a role that maybe some airports feel like it shouldn't be theirs, but that is up for discussion. It's ongoing. Obviously, the costs. This is an enormous cost for us. These systems are not cheap. Some of them, I know, exceed well over $1 million to get them in place. Obviously, there's the enforcement costs. So, anytime a pilot reports on their end a sighting that they have near an airport, that gets relayed to the controller. The controller will then work with the airport. The airport then works with their local law enforcement, sometimes their airport police, whoever it may be. If they have any good details on where the drone might be or the drone operator might be, they'll send out a squad car, and then there's all sorts of protocols that have to go into place with how the actual law enforcement responds to these incidents. And many of those responsibilities haven't been really crystallized yet on what we can or cannot do. So there's a lot of questions. A lot of the solutions really come with collaboration, being able to work with all of our partners and making sure we understand what each of our roles are. And then there's legal concerns, just the legal and regulatory framework. A lot of uncertainty about what airports can or cannot do to help solve this problem. I think we're all in the same boat. This isn't an easy problem. I know the FAA is also, struggling to get around some of these legal issues that we're grappling with. So it isn't an easy solution that we can put in place, but we're very heavily engaged, and I think we're coming up, I think, on some good solutions, hopefully within the next year or two. I think we will have something in place, but it is really trying to deal with it in the interim before now and then.
Thanks, Justin. Charlie, can you maybe talk about in your consulting role, the things you're doing for UAS?
Hey, thanks for the opportunity. It's a privilege to be here and have an opportunity to speak to maybe a little bit different perspective, since we work mostly with aerospace and defense companies from the U.S. as well as UAS builders and suppliers with USS and UTM work. So I get a look from the outside, maybe looking in a little bit. And I think in general, we could all agree that the whole process is just moving too slow. And that frustration, of course, represents on how industry makes investments and things like that. But in the end, situational awareness, as all of you know, is a component of our safety paradigm. And it's the reason that air traffic controllers call traffic. It's why you look out the window. It's how we establish our defense criteria, why we do ISR. It's how we do our intelligence. And it's a glaring hole when you get close to the airport, close to the ground, and we have a known threat. And so from the outside perspective, as Justin mentioned, there's a lot of vendors. The trickle down from the defense work that's been done is at light speed, faster than anything I've ever seen before, especially in detection. You can detect anything, a bumblebee. You may get a lot of other things, but there is so much effort going into the ability to detect drones is incredible. There's an incredible marketplace to be able to do that. What's disappointing is that in Pennsylvania, Frost & Sullivan reported that they ordered 24 detection systems for their prisons 10 days ago. This morning's news, Nebraska is doing the same thing for their prisons. They've already received 6 proposals. Prisons and detection systems can move faster than airports. And that's the disappointment about we have a known threat, we have a safety issue, security issue, and we have potential solutions that we can't really move forward. And so the defense firms who make these things are already in military operations here in the U.S. National Guard uses a certain set of criteria for how they operate with drones. The Air Force uses a different set of criteria, and they're actively pursuing other and more advanced technology to be able to handle their own operations as well as detect other operations. And so if I can leave you with one message is that from the external industry community is about detection, detection, detection. And we have an obligation to pursue that. The FAA has a number of resources to be able to deal with some of the important criteria that are there about not interfering with certain things, as do airports with their orders and ACs to be able to make sure that that happens. These are not unknown issues to any of the members of the community. But we have test sites, we have centers of excellence, we have a number of activities that are both defense and related that could actually apply. And so I think there's a number of activities that are available at our disposal to accelerate the process in the detection environment. And as such, that leads to better situational awareness and a better safety criteria, especially when you get close to that runway.
Thanks, Charlie. Orion, we're talking estimates of up to 7 million drones by 2020 in the United States. So how can you even quantify all that data, looking at different threats or careless operation?
So really this becomes reminiscent of the beginning of the laser illumination events. We've reached sort of a critical mass where the barriers to entry into acquiring a small UAS type system has become so easy that any individual can go to any mass market and purchase one. So from a operational standpoint, from a pilot standpoint, it's a matter of identifying, is the operator clueless, careless, or is it a criminal operation? There's components of safety, there's components of integration with this, but from a security standpoint, I think ultimately what we're going to be looking at is 2 different types of events from a pilot standpoint. It's either going to be a targeted type event where they're trying to impact an aircraft operation, most likely on the ground because that's the easiest way to impact an aircraft operation that's taxiing out, or it's going to be a disruption type event like we've seen in Gatwick. For me, looking down the line, it wouldn't surprise me if domestically we see a Gatwick type disruption event that does shut down a major airport, a major flight corridor, or an operation area. So how do we handle that as pilots? That sort of becomes my question at that point. And what I try to impress among our pilot groups, among individual pilots, is that if you're in a position to where you can identify it as a small UAS type system, as a drone, the report needs to be made. We need to inform ATC, we need to file our SAP reports, and we need to get that data collected so we can start identifying where our exposure areas are and our greatest areas of risk in operation.
One thing I hear is detection and mitigation are kind of the keys. So Angela, one of the problems I see is I know drone technology is on about a 2-year technology cycle, very fast. And for us, sitting in the pilot's seat, no matter who it is, as Orion mentioned, careless, clueless, a criminal, they should be in the same standards we have. But is that a huge problem, being able to develop detection systems that don't interfere with a GPS or approach things that we would use in the airplane?
There's a couple different angles to look at with detection, and I agree wholeheartedly with Charlie. Detection is a significant force multiplier in creating situational awareness and the ability to mitigate without necessarily even having to employ counter technologies. The challenges with detection, though, are several. One, there's legal challenges. Some types of detection, primarily those that are RF based, are constrained legally for being used outside of a couple of federal agencies or departments that have expressed authority for being able to, for relief from computer fraud and abuse, Wiretap Act, Pen Trap, and other things that can cause legal challenges with being able to use those technologies by other than those who have expressed congressional relief from those statutes. So there's a legal piece that is challenging. But there are radars, there's EOIR, there are other acoustic, there are other capabilities. The second challenge is in the bucket of how that technology performs in an airport environment. So you have an extremely RF dense environment. You have a lot of buildings, you have a lot of reflection, you have a lot of geographic and environmental issues that tend to degrade the performance of many detection systems in the airport environment. We did some testing back in back in 2017, early 2018, where we brought a series of detection vendors out into the airport environment, and they had a lot of challenges with their performance and their ability to actually see UAS. So there's a concern about their actual performance efficacy, as well as if there's any interference. But the interference pieces are lesser. They need to be considered and evaluated. But generally, the challenge we're finding is with actually the efficacy. You look at Gatwick, it took 36 hours to bring that to closure. It wasn't because the Brits were slow. They were actually extremely fast, and actually Gatwick had detection systems in place, but they didn't detect the UAS that were operating. So it's a really challenging environment, not only in the private sector, but even in the federal sector, to identify those capabilities that work well in particular types of environments and locations for particular types of purposes. 75% of the UAS sightings that are reported to the FAA take place more than 3 nautical miles away from the airport. And with each 2 nautical miles you go out, you drop another 25% of those. So 50% are occurring more than 5 nautical miles away from the airport. When you talk about detection at an airport, you're not getting out that far with many of the technologies that exist today. So again, it's a complex process of finding the right technology at a given location that can give you the situational awareness that you need, as well as ensuring that there aren't interference issues.
So what do you think of the, I fly a drone that's got ADSB, I can see aircraft in the area, they can't see us. If we were to turn that on, is it going to overwhelm pilots with all the traffic that we're going to see?
Yeah, and again, that's one of the challenges with, it's one of the, look, we're focusing on remote identification because there does need to be that ability to identify. That is unquestionable. The technology by which you do that and which you make that information accessible to, for example, law enforcement, ADSB, saturating the ADSB environment is probably not the best approach to that. So as we look at there are lots of other technologies, however, that can utilize things like 4G and 5G and the ability to use technology that already exists, that from a cost perspective is useful and doesn't overwhelm the spectrum with all those additional ADSB hits.
Justin, do you see some airports that have some detection capability? Do you see airports more worried about that, or are they trying to maybe talk about mitigation before detection? What do you see with the airports?
Yeah, so we've done probably way too many surveys for our members on these topics, so I think we have a pretty good pulse of what they're feeling and thinking on these issues. As far as mitigation, and we're talking interdiction, either a physical or an electronic way of actually bringing down the drone, I think airports really want to stay clear of that area. I don't really think they want to have anything to do with mitigation. Obviously, it's also clearly illegal for them to do that. So they're more than happy to pass that responsibility on to the 4 departments that currently have that authority, as Angela was talking about. As far as detection goes, it's a mixed bag, and I think it depends upon the airport. You know, it's the old phrase, you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. We all don't like that phrase, but it is very true. I think it really depends on the airport itself and how much they see of themselves as a risk as a risk to being subjected to potential drone disruption. So those usually are the larger airports because they are the bigger targets, because they feel like if there was a nefarious or terrorist-related incident, it'd probably be at a larger airport because that's where they could do the most damage. So I think you're seeing a lot of the larger airports actually venturing into the area of detection in addition because they have the resources to do that, to purchase these systems and to actually operate them and monitor them. There's a lot of work that goes into this. Even if you get a detection system, you also have to make sure you're coordinating any response that you get, any alerts that do come up through that system with FAA and the federal security partners as well as their local law enforcement. And that takes enormous internal management. I mean, a lot of these airports are now starting their own UAS working groups, which bring in federal, local law enforcement, everyone to actually do tabletop exercises and to walk through scenarios of what a disruption scenario would look like and how that would play out near an airport environment. And depending upon the airport's relationship with their local law enforcement and their partners, it's going to vary significantly by airport. So a lot of those things are happening, and I think they're more likely to be doing detection. And I think mitigation, there's just no appetite for that in the airport environment.
So one thing maybe you can address, I know there's a LANS program for identification for the 107 operators, the license plate, electronic license plate. Are those two kind of critical things that kind of tell us what's going on with the drone and how important is the FAA look at those technologies?
They're vital, and they're the two what we'll call foundational pieces of an unmanned traffic management system or set of, and the way we look at it is a set of capabilities and services that we're kind of layering on in the environment. LANS was a way to enable operators, at this point, Part 107 operators, but soon to becoming recreational operators will be required to also participate in LANS, but to identify locations and altitudes at which the operation of UAS would not be a safety hazard. So those facility maps around airports identify, in I think 1 kilometer blocks, altitudes at which they can operate in controlled airspace with an authorization under a certain altitude. If you want to fly higher than that, then it takes a little longer to potentially get that authorization. That gives us a piece of what's authorized to be there, so sort of the flight plans, if you will, that we know of who's operating. But then you have, again, recreational operators and others who aren't familiar with or the responsibilities or requirements for LANS, and that's where that remote ID piece is vital. We really can't go much farther in the integration of drones safely and securely into the airspace without remote identification, and that's why we've been focused on doing it. One of the things that when you look at kind of how things may layer, detection's important, and when we talk about mitigation, people jump to a technology, but mitigation is identifying where the operator is and getting on top of that operator, getting that UAS out of the ground, and then actually finding out what was the intent. Are they clueless or careless, or is there a criminal aspect behind their intent? Those are kind of key pieces, so it shouldn't be understated the importance of being able to find the operator, because one, you can find out the intent, two, you can educate them, or if necessary, conduct enforcement as well. And those are all key pieces of beginning to move some of that noise, so to speak, out of the airspace with unauthorized operations. But remote ID will also give you information that detection may not. You have an idea, you will know who is registered to, and be able to, again, take some actions beyond just knowing that there's a UAS there. That's a key piece for immediate situational awareness, but in terms of being able to end that unauthorized operation and then do that follow-on activity, remote identification is really going to be key.
So I know some of the manufacturers already have geofencing in the aircraft, which works. It does work really well, I can tell you. But I know Senator Schumer put some legislation forward to put that in a reauthorization act to require that. Do you think that's the right approach?
Again, the way we look at it is there are a lot of levers to be pulled all the way from prevention to detection to mitigation. And geofencing is certainly a technology solution that can be helpful. And in fact, the Drone Advisory Committee that the FAA has, it has members from air carriers, airports, from a broad cross-section of aviation industry, law enforcement. We actually provided a tasking back in June to the DAC to look at what else is out there, like geofencing and other types of potential solutions that can begin to address at least the careless and clueless piece. We're not going to regulate out on the criminal. Criminals are always going to find ways around, and that's why ultimately counter mitigation capabilities are necessary for key partners in terms of being able to address national security threats. But the ability to look at what can be done at the aircraft level and what can be done in terms of operational limitations, potentially that industry could voluntarily, agree to certain standards of putting geofencing in or early equipage of remote identification, things of that nature, will help start again to sort out and move those clueless and careless out. And so we've tasked the DAC to come back in 90 days to provide recommendations to the FAA about what types of other technology or operational limitations they might be willing to agree to in order to perhaps have access to more airspace or more complex operations. But those things will significantly help if you have someone like a DJI or Parrot, who own big parts of that market space, agreeing that they're going to put certain things on their aircraft. That's going to reach a large percentage of the flying population, and that's going to help all of us.
So we get into the mitigation piece, there's been some discussion about potentially bringing that authority down to the state and local level. Maybe you and Justin and Craig can kind of weigh out what you think, if that's a good approach.
Let me take it first.
Please.
I'll be the bad guy. Mitigation. The challenge with mitigation, and I think a couple of us have already referenced it, is a lot of that technology is built off of military technology, and the use of it safely in the civil domestic environment and in environments that are more urban is challenging. It's challenging by way of the performance of it. It's challenging by way of the interference and that it can cause to all kinds of communication systems, not the least of which is air navigation services infrastructure and onboard avionics. When you're jamming frequencies in some cases, particularly if you look at GPS jamming, that obviously we rely upon for capabilities and services within the national airspace system. But even beyond that, you have 911 operations. You have a variety of GPS-based and RF-based systems on the airport, baggage handling and other things that rely on that technology as well, that would be impacted by the use of those, particularly in the airport environment. So from the FAA's perspective, we certainly understand the need for that capability in exigent circumstances, particularly dealing with national security assets and large-scale public events like national special security events. But we have to weigh that and make sure we're doing that in a way that's safe, and a way that doesn't create a safety hazard while we're trying to address a security threat. So we work very closely with people like Craig at the Secret Service and the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, the FBI, DOD, on how and what technologies they use and where they put them, and how we can mitigate any of the collateral effects that may be created by using a particular type of technology.
And so Craig, would it help you with your protectees travel and move in a lot of places? Would it help if you could rely on the agency partners you work with to help?
Well, as I said, we're gonna work with everybody. There's only so much out there. There's only so much in the budget for each of the agencies. So you're always going to leverage what your partners have, specifically in the federal side of the house, and in leveraging the relationships we have with DOD. FAA is a huge partner to it. But just actually to dovetail on what Angela said, some of the issues you have also with mitigation is going out there, even if we were to do all the testing in secure, stable environments, now you're going to go, as you said, our protectees move around. They're consistently moving around the continental United States. They travel the world. But if you're just looking at where it's going to affect us here in the continental United States, how do you replicate each of these sites? How do you identify what's going to be basically the benefit, or what could be the harm that could be done as a result of using mitigation technology? That being said, we have to have some capability, because we'll use the good person and the bad person. That's pretty much how we're going to work. We're going to kind of treat every single UAS encounter as hostile or as the bad, until at such point it's proven to be the good, or just the clueless, as they say. So again, for our side of the house, we're in a tough environment, because we operate, unfortunately, in the iron and concrete jungle. So if we go up to New York for the United Nations General Assembly, how difficult it is to operate in that environment. How many things could you adversely affect? But on the other side of the house, how big of a target is that? It's a national special security event, 160 world leaders, President of the United States, so it's a big target for us. So it's a big challenge, again, and we do leverage with our partners. We work very hard to identify possible solutions. And on that note, we're going to try to do everything we can to keep them out of our flight restrictions, which is a little bit different from what we do with aviation. We're trying to work with the aviators to get as many aviators into the flight restriction, going through the appropriate screening to allow the commerce to continue. But currently, UAS, UAV is one of those things we're kind of trying to keep out of our flight restricted areas, because we need to keep those clear. So again, big challenge.
Yeah, I'll have a few thoughts on this. I think I always try to separate mitigation, interdiction from detection. If you look at all the incidents we've had so far near airports, even across the world, you've had one that's pretty much confirmed, I think, at this point, that it was nefarious, and that was the Gatwick incident. But most of the incidents that we've seen and heard about are temporary, careless people who don't know what they're doing and don't know they're operating near an airport. And so we really don't need the mitigation authority, I think. We don't really need to expand the mitigation authority in order to address those problems. I think if we were to focus more on the expansion of detection authority, I think that would help us detect where the careless drone operators are at, so that we can actually address the bulk of the problems. You have an aeroscope system out there right now that can detect remote ID and tracking information from all DJI drones, and there's still questions that we hear about if that's even legal or not to be used by an airport. So that stuff is silly. I think we can fix that, and I think so expanding detection seems like a no-brainer. One other thing I'll mention is enforcement. I don't think we talk enough about that, but we've been discussing maybe cooperative enforcement models. That's something that came up within the Drone Advisory Committee some time ago. But cooperative enforcement that would enable local law enforcement or airport police to enforce federal law would be very, very helpful, because many times our communities don't have anything on the books to bring the offender to justice, so to speak. So that's just one other thing I'll throw out there.
I know law enforcement's had been kind of creative when they've had incidents.
Yeah.
I mean, charge them with interfering with law enforcement activity, those sorts of things, versus actually charging them with illegal operation of a drone or something like that. Mm-hmm. So Ryan, do you think, we know that there's 3 players, 2 of them we can take care of. Do you think education from the pilot's perspective, or for an education program to help talk about operation in the national airspace would be helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah. It comes back to our Swiss cheese model we apply to every safety aspect of our operation. Any additional layer that we can put in, whether it's an education piece, detect and avoid, geofencing capabilities, to mitigate the risk from that standpoint there before it actually becomes a threat to aviation, will help us to do a couple of things. One, it eliminates a threat vector that we're looking at from a careless or clueless operator at that point. And then on top of it too, it enables our partners, the airports, law enforcement, everybody else that has a stakeholder in this situation, to better identify, more quickly identify a criminal type operation. if we've been able to, either through geofencing capabilities, for an example, to prohibit careless and clueless operations within an airport environment, and now all of a sudden we're dealing with a disruption event, it's quicker to identify that as an intentional event, and as such we can address it more appropriately with a better scaled response at that point.
And just, I don't know if we talked about this, can you speak to some of the airports, maybe what type of mitigations they're doing? If you can speak to that, which airports are doing it. And then are airports starting developing a playbook for when they have UAS issues?
A what? Link?
A playbook on what to do. Is there a playbook, operational plan?
Yeah. So there isn't any sort of standard template, I think, that you're going to be able to insert into any airport. I think the thing that airports are looking at are response protocols. So even basic response protocols. How do you respond? Communication. Who's communicating to who? How are you getting information to your local law enforcement? How are you getting information to FAA? So there's a lot of response protocols that people are putting into place. And I think that's probably the most important thing that airports can start to do. Again, the larger airports have started to use systems, particularly Aeroscope's a popular one. That allows, again, you to track exactly where DJI drones are at, because they are all equipped with remote ID. So it makes it easy to track where those are at. So a lot of airports have adopted that system. I don't know how widely we want to say that. I'm hesitant to name any specific airports because we don't want to identify where there are no systems at for certain airports. But yeah, adopting certain systems that can lead you to where the drone operator is at, because even if you do have a response protocol in place and you get a sighting or a report from a pilot, it's still very, very difficult to find where that person's at with very little information. And so many airports are just kind of throw their hands up and say, you know, I don't know what to do with this information. So the more that airports can adopt systems and then adopt protocols and get more specificity about where the drone operator's at, that's going to be very, very helpful. And that takes remote ID implementation. So that's why we're very, very supportive of that. But it's going to take time, and it's not, there isn't any standard template that we have to help solve this problem, unfortunately.
So one of the questions then is, what kind of time frame should we expect for implementation of these programs? I'll just open it up to the panel.
So, well, for remote ID, for example, the notice of proposed rulemaking will go out later this year, which is positive, and we certainly invite folks to review and provide information on that. So hopefully we can bring that to actual execution fairly expediently for rulemaking. Rulemaking is a long process, but we're trying to go as quickly as we can with that. I think as far as, you know, we continue to work with airports on technology. I think, you know, as Justin has said, there is uncertainty out there. There's a lot of legal uncertainty that creates some challenges as airports or other private sector entities consider what types of technology from a detection perspective they may want to use. But I think, again, continuing to work with airports, having airports recognize this as a hazard like other hazards that they deal with, whether that's wildlife or other things that may happen on the airport for which they have an emergency response plan, is certainly a positive step as well. We've had good exchange with our British partners who were providing lessons learned from what they've done over there in response to Gatwick, and been very free about sharing that information with airports here, as well as working government to government, which is also very positive. In terms of expanded authorities and what those next steps are, we have said as a U.S. government that it will be a phased approach, and we sort of had DOD and DOE get their authority in the late 16, early 2017 timeframe, and then in the 2018 we had DHS and Justice. I think it remains to be seen whether and what the next phase of that authority might be. I think there's a lot of interest because DHS and Justice are really just now getting their authorities and doing the testing and starting to actually deploy. I think there's interest in getting some more information about that in the civil environment and the development of counter technologies that are less impactful on NAS and other systems, communication systems, before there's probably a great sense of comfort with sort of allowing more broadly the use of counter-UAS. The FAA expends a tremendous amount of resource and time working with Craig and other departments that have the authority to have very rigorous notification procedures, coordinated use procedures, and the ability to do that level of coordination to ensure safety with a wide variety of potential mitigation system operators is challenging for us. And so when we think about expanding authorities, that's one of the things that concerns us. The current state of technology and the level of coordination required to mitigate the safety hazards associated with some of that technology is not something we could do with 18,000 law enforcement departments across the country. So it's figuring out how we hopefully move industry and with the other things like remote identification, geofencing, other types of technologies where we can start to close some of those security gaps without potentially having to release that type of authority to a wide swath of other entities where it becomes a safety hazard in the airspace environment.
The floor is open for questions. I haven't seen any come up yet, but obviously it's open if you'd like to come up with the aisles. I haven't not seen a text one yet. Charlie, the people you're talking to, what do they think about mitigation, detection, and the timelines?
Well, I have to say most of our clients really would enjoy the mitigation part, but we're not going to talk about that. That's kind of what they do for a living, and but they usually do it in a different environment. So when you put it in this context, it's all about the detection component. A couple things. I mean, completely agree with the panel that remote ID is vital to going forward. It's why all your airlines have equipped with ADS-B, right? It's about bringing precision into the NAS, and then as you get more precise, there's a lot of great things you can do with that. But there, the binary situation with good guy, bad guy in the drone world, though, is a little bit of a misnomer. As we do training for some of these activities, like for inspections and things like that, we always do them out in the middle of nowhere, and it all works well. And then these commercial operators come into an urban environment, and then they themselves get interfered with, and so flyaways are a huge issue. And people like DJI have done a great job at becoming, having proprietary solutions in their later and later drones. And of course, the price point is getting higher and higher to make sure that that doesn't happen, so they get longer flight capability, but also a less jammable thing. But there's still millions of drones out there that won't have remote ID and are highly subject to flyaway. And they're just as much of a danger to you as the bad operator or even a foolish operator. So we're still into the big detection component. And the FAA does have some, in the reauthorization language, is a set of demonstrations that will take place at airports for that detection capability. And of course, the industry would love for that to be accelerated and things like that. There was a broad agency announcement for some other demonstrations, but it's been specifically excluded for this kind of opportunity. So we would like to see that move as quickly as possible so that we can get this on the table for to show what industry, how the trickle down, how quickly that's done, and be able to resolve the issues about what the operational component is. I mean, so it's one thing to see, but then we do have to take the step for what that playbook or whatever that will look like. So,
Question?
Hey, good morning. My name is Brian Lesk. I'm the chairman for the Aircraft Design and Operations Group, and we have some UAS design stuff in our wheelhouse as well. One part question: while we understand that the NPRM for small UAS is coming out later this year at some point, rulemaking takes a long time, as we all know in this room, for small UAS. What do our pilots need, or what can our pilots in this room right now take away for reporting? What do you need to hear? What types of things can distinguish the UAS from a bird, a Kevlar balloon, some of those types of things? What type of verbiage can our guys take and go fly the line tomorrow and help you report that threat going forward? What would you like to hear from us?
So in the FAA, we actually have the UAS safety team, and Justin talked about it. That is a significant focus right now, is coming up with some clearer criteria and specificity around that language that's used. I will tell you, part of my organization is a law enforcement assistance program. I've got about 20 agents nationwide, and every single pilot report that we receive, or actually any report we receive, but the predominance are PIREPs, on a UAS, I have an agent that will call the law enforcement agency that, to whom our tower reported that, and try to ascertain if there's an operator. So we desperately want to be able to follow up on those, and the clearer we can be in specifying the information associated with those. I don't, to give you I don't want to sort of preempt the UAST's work, but I know that is what they're driving towards, is providing much clearer guidance and information about how to report those in a way that is more accurate. Again, until we can validate those through things like remote identification, it's tough. But we are trying to follow up to the best that we can, but the vast majority, 99% plus, there's no operator identified, so unfortunately there's generally not a lot more we can do beyond kind of having the process for the pilot giving the best information they have to the tower, and the tower passing that on to law enforcement, and then obviously issuing traffic or anything else, depending on what the report indicates in terms of a potential safety risk. Justin, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I'll just add so you can have another question really quickly. Just report it. We're working on standardizing the reporting methods so that we get the most information out of you all, but report it. There's more and more airports now that are having protocols in place for how to, and FAA, on how to respond to these types of reports in a more efficient way so we can address the problem as best as we can. So just report it. That's the key thing.
Hey, Darren Doran, a question more on the security side. I'm not really concerned with our casual or careless individual. So I guess, Craig, this would probably go to you or Angela. So I'm looking at Amazon here, sitting as we're talking. I'm going to order up my agricultural drone. I'll be able to pick it up this afternoon or tomorrow morning. I can deliver 25 pounds of chemical agent. And then I popped up, what's the latest events going on in the DC Capital Region today? And there's the 50th anniversary tonight. There's a jazz festival tomorrow. There's some open air events going on. And I know Craig, Secret Service just put out their attacks on public places here for 2018. I understand we're focused on aviation, but this technology is in use overseas. The knowledge transfer is excellent with our enemies. If I go spray water over a public event, I'm going to trample to death 100 or 200 people. So when we look at that, hey, mitigation, we want to keep that up to the national level. You have got to get that down to the local law enforcement level, or give them that emergency response authority, because the way I see it right now is the cat's out of the bag, and how are we going to protect this? Because it's going to happen. So what are your thoughts on, I know when the Secret Service has a national security event, Republican National, Democratic National Convention, Super Bowl, anywhere the president's at, you guys roll in with your semi-trailers and you're protecting that airspace, and you can have your technology to see what's out there. But for the rest of these events, almost every weekend, 20, 30, 40, 80,000 people, how do we protect them?
I can tell you that's what keeps me up at night.
Okay.
So, but
General Mattis, thank you.
yeah. But I will say that for our environment, you even referenced it. For what we do for each of the visits that we handle on our protected sites, that's what we handle on an everyday basis, and that's what our advance is. That's why we get there a week or two in advance of any visit to try to identify potential vulnerabilities and then come up with a solution or create a barrier for that vulnerability. As for the stuff that's sitting in the national capital region, or if you want to go outside, you just want to go to Iowa today and we're not there, we agree with you. That's what we look at. Again, our mission is specific to the location that we're protecting and the people that we're protecting, but that doesn't mean that we don't think about the other stuff. So again, it's what keeps us up at night. But we are working, hopefully some of the stuff that we are working with and working with our partners will be able to translate to the stadiums, things like that, or marches, because that will be adversely affected. And Angela?
Yeah, so again, it gets back to weighing the risk of the technology and how it performs in a civil environment. Because, just as you have that agricultural drone flying over, and absolutely don't dispute the concern there, but also trying to take control of that and move that over a large crowd of people has a safety risk unto itself as well. And the Super Bowl is an excellent example. The FBI will tell you that they had the technology capability there to detect and to mitigate, and they used the detection to get teams on the operators because that's the safest way to get it out of the sky. So again, the coordination we do with people like Craig is extensive to be able to use those technologies safely. So we need to drive the industry into building capabilities that are not impactful, so we're not creating safety hazards while we're trying to address security risks.
Well, it looks like we're out of time, just as we've got a few questions. I'm sorry I didn't see the people to my right, but I'd like to, again, thank each one of you for coming in and talking about your expertise and laying out the issues for today. And also like to thank the audience for their participation. Hope you found the conversation useful, educational, relevant to our job, and hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.